Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on how to centrally manage data privacy laws and prevent violations. My name is Soharti Samsudin, and I am the Marketing Manager for Mega Asia Pacific, and we're thrilled to have such a great group on the line joining us today. So before we go to the next slide where I will introduce your speakers, I'd just like to do a quick housekeeping piece. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them in the question box in the GoToWebinar sidebar. We'll try to get to all the questions at the end of the presentation, but if there's anything we miss or if we run out of time, we will be happy to follow up after the webinar. So a little bit about Mega. Some of you may or may not know it. Mega is a well-established and fast-growing enterprise architecture software vendor. We are recognized as an enterprise architecture leader by all the analysts, including the ones you see on the screen. So we have over 2,000 customers worldwide, and that's more than 52 countries, and we've been around for more than 30 years now. And here are your speakers for today. We have on the line Dr. Jerome Godard, who is our Services Director for APAC, and we also have Michele Imperiali, who is the Product Owner for Mega International. So without further ado, Jerome, I turn the presentation over to you. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Sue, and welcome everyone. I will start by turning off my camera because the motivation is not to look at me, but to focus on the content of this presentation and also to secure the bandwidth. So let me just switch off the camera and start with the presentation. So it's a real pleasure for me to see many people joining this session, covering the whole APAC region with people in many countries. This shows clearly that today's topic on data privacy management is a real concern in all organizations in the countries in the region. There's no doubt about that. To start with, let's have a wrap up on where we are now with around personal data privacy. Some years have passed since the rollout of the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been one of the key regulation designed in Europe, the GDPR regulation, to put a very strong framework on data privacy management. Yet, people are still talking about the difficulties for companies, for organizations to comply with privacy regulations, while acknowledging, of course, still that the data privacy is a major threat which companies and organizations face every day. Like most regulations, lawyers are very able to explain what are the regulatory requirements, but the most important challenge is how these requirements should be adopted and implemented by organizations. So because at the end of the day, for those companies, those organizations, it is not just about avoiding fines from the regulator, though it is of course a very important motivation, but it's moreover about the reputation of the organization and not losing business, not losing customers, clients, users, because of issues really pertaining to data privacy management. So if we consider the fines that are being applied or charged to some organization all around the world, we can consider two main key reasons for those fines. First, we would point to the lack of transparency on how companies, organizations are processing personal data. This is a real challenge for all companies and organizations to handle this information, to manage it properly, both about external stakeholders, but also for internal stakeholders. The lack of transparency means that companies don't really explain to their customers, but also to their internal stakeholders, what's happening with their data. Sometimes it's on purpose because companies want to take advantage of this information, of this personal data, but sometimes it's not at all on purpose. It's not because things are not under control. So they don't do it simply because they don't know in detail how their customers' data are being used and processed. This is a typical factor. The second main reason for those fines is data breaches. You're all aware of this unfortunately very common daily topic on the data breaches happening in all types of organizations. Once those breaches are publicly disclosed, it's always triggering an investigation from the authorities all around the world applying those regulations. The bodies, authority bodies, are ending up with a fine, charging those organizations lacking security measures or control on managing the data of their customers or their internal stakeholders. So as you can see on the slide, we have some example of fines that have been paid by large companies in the past few years, especially in the context of GDPR. But in the end, those fines are not the big piece of the iceberg. What's really at stake here is the organization reputation and, again, their own business. So we've seen that those companies have been losing very important parts of their share of the stock price when those breaches have been publicly announced. So this is a key concern for these organizations, again, from the boss perspective, to avoid paying fines, but also to remain strong in terms of business. And they definitely want people to avoid moving from their business in order to remain happy customers. So let's have a look at the data privacy law around the globe. Let's start with Europe and US, where the biggest regulations have been put in place initially for some years already. GDPR, again, is the main large framework that has been designed in the 2010s and being enforced since 2018, with already some reviews being in progress to update the regulation and to bring some new requirements. On this map, you can see a kind of maturity level of the countries all around the world. So this is assessed by the organization. You can see at the bottom of the screen. By the way, I recommend you to use this website. It's very convenient to follow up and to keep up to date on the evolution of the regulation in every country around the world. So countries in red on this map have regulations that are quite comprehensive, such as GDPR, and where data is fully protected, at least from a regulatory standpoint. Very strong frameworks. Yellow, orange, and green means that it becomes less and less regulated somehow, less and less mature in terms of regulation. If we look at United States, for instance, they have quite a complex patchwork of national, state, and local privacy laws. So it's a federal organization, of course, and there is no comprehensive national privacy law in the US. However, they have a number of largely sector-specific privacy and data security laws at the federal level, as well as many more privacy laws at the state and local level. So it's definitely a patchwork of many layers of laws that companies and organizations have to consider to operate and to consider compliance in the US. If we take the specific example of California, they have more than 25 state privacy and data security laws. So it's quite huge, including the recently enacted California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, which imposed substantial requirements and restrictions on the collection, use, disclosure of personal information. So while the CCPA was the first cross-sector comprehensive privacy law in the US, several others have since been passed, including the California Consumer Privacy Rights Act, CPRA, which takes effect on January 1st, 2023, and will amend the CCPA. So I won't get, the motivation today is not to drill down into all those laws, those regulations, but to give you an idea on how it is organized, how it is structured, and how it evolves. So just to complete the kind of west view of the world with America, you see that in South America, you also have various level of maturity on this topic, with Argentina and Brazil, where regulations similar to GDPR are being introduced or have been introduced. So now, if we focus on the APAC region, if we just look at the past 2 years, we've seen data protection regulations either being enforced or being put in place. So in Singapore, for example, in New Zealand, in Hong Kong. More notably, Thailand, for instance, will launch its PDPA regulations starting on the 1st of June this year. So again, in some countries, it's work in progress. In some countries, it's already quite active and enforced. So there are gaps, of course. And this map is quite convenient to visualize where we are today in the region regarding the data privacy laws. What we can see also is that as for the other continents, the approach varies from one country to another. First, with federal countries like Australia, where local regulation at the state level are also applied. Some other countries like China will rely more on a set of various laws, in most of the Southeast Asian countries, the current status is working on amendments to existing regulations. So not to create a framework from scratch, such as the DPIA, but updating existing laws or regulations. If we consider then specific sectors, they can have their own specific rules, such as IM8 in Singapore, for instance, managed by GovTech for governmental agencies, which defines very strictly and precisely what is expected for the citizen-facing applications from the governmental agencies. So if now we have a look at how this law needs to be taken into consideration and how to ensure that these organizations around the world, but in APAC especially, being companies, governmental agencies, can comply to them. So first of all, we'll have a quick look on a few examples on that you can all see on the news, on a concrete example of data privacy issues, breaches that are happening in the region. We can start with a very significant number, which is on the top left corner. That's 6 out of 10 Asia-Pacific firms have been facing at least one data breach in the past 12 months. So more than half of the organizations have been facing at least once a data breach. And this is in the past year in APAC. So this is critical. This is enormous, and we can very simply and straightforwardly say that no organization can avoid facing this kind of issue. So this is a concern for everyone. If we move down to the screen to the next screenshot, we see that a search on CIO.com shows plenty of incidents in the regions. We have some in the past years. Again, it's a never-ending story, unfortunately, and more to come. So we have to get used to that. It's unfortunately normal, unavoidable, and the idea is to make sure things are as much as possible under control, and that organizations know how to react to address those issues. If we look now at the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that in the past year, massive personal data breaches have been observed in Thailand, in Indonesia. I'm just taking 2 examples, but we have, of course, examples for every country in APAC. And as you can see at the bottom on the right side, regulators are now being more and more strict and applying definitely the regulation, which means charging fines to the organizations that are facing those breaches when they miss the compliance on the regulation. So now the key question for us is, how can we help organizations better manage personal data and limit as much as possible breaches and the issues on data privacy management? So well, the key thing that when we talk about data privacy, we really talk about breach prevention, as you could see on the previous slide. So this is the key concern, of course. And as we've seen in Thailand and other countries around the globe, numerous privacy laws have been issued with requirements that really aim at limiting the risks on breaches and abuse, not just putting fines, bringing fines, but securing the data of citizens, of consumers, of customers. So it's complex, of course, for companies to comply with these regulations and assess properly the level of compliance, especially for companies dealing with Excel documents and simply ticking a few boxes to make sure that major privacy requirements were met. This is where data privacy solutions, like of course Hopex can propose, can help to deal with the main challenges ahead. And moreover, today, companies have to be very careful on how all these regulations are connected to each other. You remember the example from the US, but it actually applies to China and other large countries. You have a set of various regulations you have to take into consideration and make sure you don't miss any impact between them. So a typical example, if you're processing some information from people residing in California, you have to make sure that you comply with CCPA and other local regulations in California. So it's not about citizen, it's not about necessary people where they're located at a specific time. It's about being resident and submitted to a specific regulation through the local authorities. So obviously there's a certain number of requirements which are shared among those those regulations, those laws. Between CCPA and GDPR, for instance, there are similarities. So the main objective is to maximize your compliance effort so that what you do for one regulation, you don't have to do it again, and for other pieces of regulation that would be similar. So the idea is to optimize, of course, your effort and make things as efficient as possible in handling your compliance effort. Yet every organization, wherever you are in the world, will have to prove that the compliance with GDPR, for instance, is effective and can be documented. So a recurring word in this regulation for GDPR is the accountability principle, which is repeated a huge amount of time in the regulatory text. So accountability is key. This means that whatever company does, it is its duty and responsibility to keep the data safe, and it will have to prove to the right that the right choices, the right implementations have been done to achieve this objective. Another tricky situation to manage is producing this regulatory documentation. In the end, to prove that you're compliant, you have to provide those proofs, those documentation to the regulator. And this is not a trivial task, as most organizations don't have a consolidated practice in place, even stakeholders or roles to manage this information and to structure it and deliver it properly to the regulator. So ideally, everybody would like to have just to click on a simple button to generate this documentation. This is, of course, what solutions such as Hopex can provide. So, facing these difficulties for the compliance and the documentation of this compliance bring danger of not complying and to face regulatory deadlines through the regulators. But this pressure is going to grow. You need to be aware of that. So being ready to face those requirements and to document them is definitely a key activity every organization has to take into consideration and into account as we speak. So for that, implementing a sound data security strategy to prevent the efficiency and respond to the data breaches is critical for all of you, all of us. If we move to the next slide, we will see that how Hopex privacy management, so our solution, helps organization in 3 ways to meet the regulator expectations. First of all, the idea is to make sure that we identify and the solution guides your organization towards compliance. So facilitating the onboarding on the compliance management, identifying the regulatory gaps, implementing the needed remediation actions, of course, and then, as much as possible, automatically producing the documents to demonstrate and prove accountability. The second key pillar is that the solution, in that case Hopex, of course, would help you mapping out how people, processes, technologies use data within your organization. So of course, Hopex as an enterprise architecture repository does that very natively, and helps companies defining how they can prioritize and mitigate the risks to efficiently secure data and prevent breaches and violations. So the architecture for that in Hopex provide detailed context, enabling companies to clearly see how data flows across the company, are crossing the company from one silo to another, and then facilitating the identification of vulnerabilities, avoiding fines, and lost revenue, of course. The third key pillar here is to combine the regulatory requirements with a context that makes it possible for company to get more control on understanding how their data is used and how it works within the organization and outside of the organization. So through these activities, definitely our solution Hopex helps reducing the cost that is required on IT security investment, adapt a sound data processing culture, and ensure data quality, and of course be transparent with as much as you want and you can with your stakeholders, internal and external, on how the information is managed. So leveraging in a proper way on the data you process to get the value out of it is the and output we propose through this approach. And again, let's face it, we know that data breaches are here and they're going to stay. They're going to happen, unfortunately, probably more and more. So things are improving on some security levels and some practices, but still, things can go wrong and they shall go wrong. That's unfortunate, but this is what it is. So the objective now is to make sure you know what to do when it happens, when a data breach occurs, and you can prove you've done all that was in your control to manage and limit this breach, and be transparent about it. Again, accountability is key, and this is what it takes to keep the trust of your stakeholders, of your customers, of your citizens, if you're a governmental agency, to show transparency and accountability. So let's see now what approach we are proposing in 4 steps to ensure and support organization embarking and delivering on data privacy management. So first of all, for step 1, Hopex, our solution, helps you document your data usage. And this is the key starting point, of course, to let you understand how the data is used within your organization and outside of the organization, and why. This is very important to understand why data is used, of course, and what for. So the first step is to have visibility on how your company processes personal data. So this means that you will have to build a data protection vocabulary, aligning with a shared understanding on these assets within the organization is key to be able to manage it, of course. Most of you may have already implemented this as part of your compliance initiatives that hopefully you have already started. So I'll go faster on this slide to make sure we can focus on the next steps, which are actually more valuable. But this is the starting point that cannot be avoided. So again, making sure that all your different stakeholders are involved in this analysis, in sharing the understanding on your data vocabulary and data handling is important. And hence, you have to define the organizational structure required to take advantage from the data protection compliance initiative. This can be the organizational structure covering several aspects of the business, not necessarily privacy compliance, but you must identify the most important role in the business that are in touch with the data, the personal data management, again, from your internal or external stakeholders. Those which will be involved in the different phases of your compliance initiative, so people responsible to update the information and who should to be notified when a breach occurs. So identifying stakeholders, putting the responsibility on them, and making sure they're in the loop whenever an incident occurs. So these stakeholders have to be notified, have to be as much as possible informed whenever it happens, and our solution for that helps providing workflows, notifications to make sure people are alerted and know what to do, are guided into the next actions through the workflows that are making it possible to automate as much as possible the process and to guide the process for what people need to do. Finally, you will start the documentation of your record of processing activities. So you will see that a bit later. All I'm describing now, of course, will be contextualized in a real demo that Michele will show you in a few minutes. So for those of you who are still late in the adoption of a solution to address compliance and privacy compliance, you're probably now using Excel or typical Word documents to document this and to try to control it. Hopefully you will have established within your company or your organization templates to ensure that this common vocabulary across your organization is visible and shared. That could be a starting point in putting in place a solution by importing this data, this vocabulary, and this shared perspective in a solution as a first step to embark on the journey to automate the process. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that now step 2 will focus on tackling all the requirements of potentially worldwide data protection regulations such as GDPR or CCPA that you need to comply with. So this second step is to identify and track how data flows across the organizations are being subjected to those regulations. So far, what we did was simply identifying why we process personal data and making sure that we are able to document this in a consistent way within a solution. Now we go one step further, as we have to understand what's happening with this data. For instance, it may be first processed for a purpose, then sent to an IT system within your organization. This system may aggregate other information coming from outside the organization for a second purpose, and then we might send this data to a subcontractor who will do something with it before destroying it or removing it or not. So this chain of action of processing activities is key to document, to define, to design, to have a full understanding on what's happening on the data. So this type of logic is key to understand. Otherwise, you will be taken by surprise as soon as, for example, the subcontractors calls you and lets you know that what they just faced a data breach, and it's not clear what data is gone, when, under what process. So if you don't understand the data flow, you won't know what to do. Of course, you won't know how to react and to deal with this data breach. So instead, you would have done if you have done your homework and rely on a strong solution for that, you would be able to access to the list of your subcontractors and see exactly where the subcontractors are involved on the data handling, and you will understand exactly what data is impacted by this breach, and therefore your decision on how to act and the measures that need to be taken will be much easier. And whether or not the data breach leads to a wrong situation or not, some data breaches are actually not damaging, some are, of course. You still have to record the data breaches and keep evidences showing that you are aware of the data. Again, don't forget, you need to own this process, and the regulator expects you to show that you control it and you're not missing anything, even if it doesn't create issues for the stakeholders this data is about. So once the data breach occurs, it can be you are notified through an internal audit that a given database was left with free access over the internet, for instance. You have to log this event, you have to assess the impact of this data breach, and at the end of the assessment, you might realize that no personal data was in this database. So again, data breaches are not always critical or damaging. Still, you need to keep a record of your assessment in your compliance monitoring tool so that you will be able to show to the regulator that you did your work and that things have been managed properly. Now you also have to identify some KPIs relevant to your organization, and you need to monitor those KPIs. Again, having a tool for that is very helpful and makes it possible to save a lot of time to track, update, and produce dashboards using those KPIs. If we go to the next step, step 3, it's all about contextualization and how it can help you to understand the actual risk and evaluate it. So here we want to really take a closer look at how data flows between the different IT systems or stakeholders, processes, and the business operations are taking place. The idea is to contextualize what we do with the processed personal data so that we can effectively reduce this risk. If you only document your data as a privacy regulator asks you, identifying your risks and reducing them will be very complex. So the motivation also on this step is not just to comply to what the regulator expects, but to make your operation stronger and more reliable for yourself and for your customers. So very likely you will go further than what the regulator is asking you actually, and indeed creating a data protection vocabulary with its data categories remains the first generic concept that you would probably create in any case. So something helping your organization to behave better and to involve other stakeholders such as data analysts, data architects that can help you to understand what the link between your privacy categories of personal data and the various data layers are: business, logical, physical. So again, here you have an opportunity to engage with stakeholders within your organization to bring more control and take advantage of the data that is within your organization to handle it better and get more value out of it. So once you can appreciate what business objectives this data contributes to and how it is sorted brings again more value to your company, to your organization, and not just from a regulatory and compliance perspective. Then if we consider the next slide, we'll see that our platform, I'm sorry, if we can just move to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, yeah, my bad, I'm moving too fast. What we need to consider now is the ability to implement a true integrated risk management approach. This is the fourth step, sorry about that. That makes it possible to efficiently protect data and reduce costs for the required security investment. So this fourth step is very important in order to draw a long road and to go through a long journey on your data privacy management. Because once we have all of this in place, we will have a very comprehensive understanding of the impact of the existing risks, so we can help the organization in taking strategic decisions and implementing appropriate measures to prevent the risk to occur. So here we are less, again, about compliance, but more taking advantage of all this visibility, all this information to reduce risks and put things more under control in your organization. So on that, Hopex will be very helpful to help you identify the biggest weaknesses in the systems within the organization. And using our solution will definitely help you streamline your efforts and smooth the communication between your various stakeholders. So hope those 4 steps are clear for you, but there's nothing better than a demo and seeing it in context to understand how it operates, and our Hopex solution can support you, guide you, help you in delivering this value. So let's now have a look with Michele on how Hopex and our data privacy solution will make this actionable for you.
Hopex Privacy Management is an application which has been designed in order to help organizations comply with worldwide privacy regulations, such as the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, the Californian Consumer Privacy Act in California in the US, the Brazilian Data Protection Regulation in Brazil, and so further. It includes several functionalities whose main objective is help organizations document how they process personal data, assess the risks which are related to this processing of personal data, and making sure that all applicable requirements of worldwide privacy regulations are actually respected. Let's now go into the core of the solution. So the record of processing activity here is where organizations will document all the activities which involve the processing of personal data. So this is the record of processing required for GDPR by the Article 30, in other words. And it's a requirement which is shared by every worldwide privacy regulation. So documenting a processing activity consists in providing a list of standard information. As usual in the solution here, we can have a status which allows us to distinguish between processing activities which are not yet in production, so these are candidate processing activities, and others which are actually in product, which are real processing of personal data, or some processing activities which are obsolete, are no longer taking place. For every processing activities, we can provide a purpose and the main legal entity and department which is in charge for the processing activity with a specific role. So here we are saying that this processing activity is under the responsibility of Acme Canada, which is processing data with a role of data controller. And this processing activity has an activity owner, Lucilla. Lucilla is a Hopex user who can, thanks to this assignment, will be able to log into Hopex Privacy Management and with a contributor license access to the details of these processing activities up to the first 3 sections, which are used to document how data is processed, in order to provide information about what's happening to the personal data, if there are third parties involved, what type of security measures are implemented, and so forth. We will see this in a minute. If we scroll down, we see that there are other information that we can document on the processing activity level, such as specific sensitive activities which are related to the processing activity. Here we can, for example, tag the fact that this processing activity is involved in the processing of data on a large scale. We can also document whether the processing activity involves IT processing or paper processing or both, and provide a specific date range for the actual processing activity. If we take a look at the legal basis, here is where we document how, why we are entitled to process this personal data. What is the legal ground we are exploiting in order to make sure that data is processed in compliance with applicable regulations. So here we're saying that in the context of our call center outbound activities, the legal basis that we take as legal ground is the specific consent. So we have asked consent to the users, to the data subjects we are calling, in order to be allowed to process their personal data. Okay. Whenever a DPO wants to review a processing activity, which has been documented by the activity owner, he will do so using these fields. Here I'm able to review what has been provided by the activity owner and say whether I believe that the provided answer, the provided information, makes the processing activity compliant or not. Going into the details of the processing activity, we can further document what's happening within it. So first of all, we are able to eventually describe additional participants in the context of the processing activity. So we might want to identify third parties that are eventually processing data in the context of the processing activity. Here, for example, we might want to document the fact that we are using an external consulting firm as a data processor, or we might also want to document specific applications that are used in the context of the processing activity. For instance, here we use the call center application, which is actually provided by PwC, for instance, which is also processing data as a data processor, right? If we decide that we want to provide additional information with respect to these elements, we can do so in the section underneath. Okay. Let's now select, go back to the global description of the processing activity. So we select the first line, and here we can document which are the data being processed by the processing activity. So, and here we understand why it's crucial to have a key element section properly populated. Because here we are going to reuse the elements that have been created in the key elements section. So I'll be able to say, okay, here we use biometric data and contact data of whom? Of the clients, for instance. And as we can see here, there is a risk which is automatically computed by Hopex, considering the default risks that were associated to these elements we have just selected, and taking the maximum among them. Okay, and eventually we can go ahead and provide an expert view and say that actually this risk here is very high. If we want to describe this process personal data even further, we can provide information regarding the volume of data being processed, and if from a privacy point of view, what is the minimization level. Minimization means if we are processing only strictly necessary data for the purpose of our processing activity. So if we believe that it is not the case, here we might say that the minimization is very low, where we should reduce the data being processed. And as mentioned before, here we could say for how long we process this type of data. Okay. If we go further, we can document which are the data subjects' rights which are managed in the context of this processing activity, and if there is a notice in place, a privacy notice, and if consent is managed. Here, since, for instance, we can see that the activity owner told us that the legal basis of the processing activity is based on consent, but here it documented that no consent is managed, so we're not collecting real consent from the data subjects. And so the DPO went ahead here and said that the processing activity is not compliant. These indicators will then be used once we carry out the assessment, the proper assessment of the processing activity. If we describe some data flows, so here we see that some data flows have been described, saying that data is sent to a specific recipient, in this case PwC in Brazil. This was possible since PwC was created in the organization section in the third parties management with an establishment in Brazil. Otherwise, we would not have been able to select it here. And we went even further, specifying exactly what type of data was sent, what type of data subjects are affected by this transfer, what is the associated risk, and if some safeguards to the data transfer have been put in place. Again, these safeguards are selected among the ones that were defined here under the transfer safeguard section in the key elements. So we're able to see at the end where is the risk mitigation and the final risk level of our data transfer. We can go ahead and also assign here a compliance level to this section. Regarding security measures, here again we can document which is the level of security measures adopted by this processing activity, selecting security measures among those which have been defined in the key elements. And we can say that these security measures are actually providing a very high mitigation of existing risks. Okay, we can also describe organizational measures or existing certification systems that we have in place. Last but not least, we can document what type of computing devices, removable devices, or physical archives are involved in the processing of personal data. And if required, we might want to attach any contractual agreement which is specific to this processing activity and that we want to link to the processing activity itself. Okay. Once this is done, if somebody there is a regulation section here, which is used in order to manage any type of regulation, privacy regulation, also internal policies that might impact the business. And whenever we link this regulation to a processing activity, saying, for example, GDPR impacts this processing activity, we will find evidence of this regulation here. And it will be particularly important once the DPO assess, for instance, the compliance of this processing activity to see which are the actual regulations the processing activity should comply with. So once this is done, as a privacy professional, we have reviewed the details of the processing activity. We can go ahead and carry out a pre-assessment. Hopex pre-computes a compliance level and a risk level for us based on the different compliance values that we have provided in the various section of the processing activity record. And we can see here that we are provided with a poorly compliant final level and a high risk level. So we are suggested by Hopex to run a data protection impact assessment, which is a detailed risk assessment, we can eventually decide to further edit these values and then go ahead and store this pre-assessment. Once we hit on record, it will be stored here, and selecting any specific pre-assessment from this list will provide us with a read-only version of the processing activity with at the time the pre-assessment was carried out. Okay. If we want to go back to the processing activity, we use the breadcrumb here. So once we are happy with it, let's pretend that we have to carry out a DPIA. So let's go ahead and start one DPIA. Again, we are provided with a reminder of the indicators that were compliance indicators of the processing activity. We can decide to pre-fill the new DPIA with results of, for example, the last DPIA that was carried out on this same processing activity. By doing so, we won't have to start from scratch our work. So we will, Hopex will pre-fill our DPIA with everything that was done in the previous DPIA. And eventually we can go ahead and create some risks regarding the processing activity, eventually specifying if there are security measures among the existing ones which mitigate this risk, and ultimately say what is the severity of this risk and the likelihood of it occurring. Okay. Whenever risks are identified in Hopex, if we create a new risk, we will be prompted with a question whether to reuse an existing risk or create a new one. Okay. In the recommendation section, we will be able, as we can see here, we have imported some data from the DPIA we used before. We can decide to create new recommendations. For instance, this one, which is actually mitigating the risk we have just created, providing a description and a resulting value of the mitigating risk. Okay. If we want to provide any attachment, we can do so here. And as a last step, we can go ahead and validate that the automatically computed value here are actually good for us. And we can either finalize the DPIA or save it for later in order to come back to it in a second time and finalize it. So here we're going to discard it. Let's not forget that at any time, if we identify things that require interventions and specific action plans to be implemented, we can use this as a platform feature. We can go ahead and create a new action plan. And this will allow us with standard workflows to follow up on all the different actions that we have identified in order to reduce compliance gaps that were identified by the privacy team. Okay. Processing activities, we have discussed about this, but we haven't seen it. Processing activities are equipped with a workflow. So every time a new processing activity is created and assigned to an activity owner, we can send it to the activity owner in order for it to be completed. Once the activity owner completes the description, the processing activity will be ready for pre-assessment, eventually will go to ready for DPIA, and then will be assessed. These workflows can be obviously customized in order to respond to specific clients' requirements. In order to, so at any given time, once we have described our record of processing here, we can go ahead And these are lists are equipped with Excel-like features, so we can reorganize the columns, we can filter them based on specific needs. For instance, here we might want to focus only on processing activities of the HQ entity. We can select all of them and build our record of processing report. This is a ready-to-use Word report which extracts all the information required by the Article 30 of GDPR or any other similar regulation. This Word report can be fully customized if required. Okay. Here it is. Right, so a description of every processing activity with an introduction explaining how this document is actually built, and then all the details of the processing activities we have just downloaded. So Hopex Privacy Management also provides a way to manage data subject requests and data breaches. Let's take a quick look at how this works. So data subject requests are actually managed via a pretty simple to use register. So whenever we receive a data subject request, it can be stored into Hopex Privacy Management. The request has a status with a description of the request, the type, where it came from, when, so automatically how many days have passed since the request was received. If we require an extension of the deadline to manage the request, which is typically of 30 days, the priority, what's the person assigned, and so further. Okay. Once we receive a request, we can assign a scope to it, so we can either say that it affects a specific legal entity or a specific department or a specific processing activity. Okay. We can attach any piece of evidence to the request, and if required to take remediation plans or specific actions and we want to track them, we can create action plans for the request and link them to it. At any given time, if we want to have an overview of what has been going on with the specific request, we can access to the activity feed, and here we will be reminded of what has changed with respect to a given time interval with respect to the request. Same approach applies to personal data breaches. The majority of the privacy regulations require to record data breaches and assess them in order to understand whether personal data was affected by the breach. Whenever we experience a breach, we will be able to record it in Hopex, and with information such as the date of the breach, date of discovery, automatically computed hours from breach discovery. In case of for the GDPR, we have a commitment to notify the authority 72 hours after the breach has occurred, and if it has associated risks for the affected data subjects. And here we can go ahead, as we can see in describing how many people were impacted by this breach, what type of data subjects. We can document the breach scope in the same way of the data subject request, and we can assess the breach, so we can document the consequences of the breach, and eventually which were the actions taken in order to remediate it. If required, we can document when data subjects were notified, or if and when supervisory authorities were notified. As usual, we can attach any type of evidence to the breach. So Hopex Privacy Management comes with pre-built reports, which are very useful in order to monitor the overall compliance of the organization. We can, for instance, take a look whenever we launch a compliance initiative and we document our processing activities. One of the first questions is where should we start in addressing compliance issues. So a possible approach is to take a look at the data risk report. So here we are presented with a table which shows us where each type of data category is processed. So here we see that biometric data is processed in these 3 processing activities. And eventually we might say that for a very high risk data categories, we want to make sure that all associated processing activities have been assessed. So we might want to use this report and making sure that all these 3 processing activities have indeed an associated assessment. Here we see that the last time they were assessed was in 2019, so probably we will want to review the assessment to make sure that it's still valid. And if a DPIA was carried out, we also see this information here. If we decide to work on from another point of view, for instance, from a data subject's point of view, here there is a second table which shows us where client's data, for instance, is processed. And we can see that we have the list of processing activities processing client's data. And again, we might want to make sure that these processing activities have been assessed recently. If we go back to the list of reports, we have reports showing us third parties involved in the different processing activities. So here we see that we have 2 third parties involved in the processing activity called Center Outbound, and this report helps us to identify whether there are third parties involved in processing activities that haven't been recently assessed. If we go further, there might be an interest in identifying data transfers, so making sure that these are all under control. So here we have the list of all existing data transfers in the processing activity, and we can build a data transfer map which shows us the flows of data from one country to the other, highlighting flows which are actually related to going to extra EU countries which are not GDPR adequate. Okay, so we can see what is the processing activity involved in this data flow, and then eventually take counter actions. It's very important to say these are standard reports, but we can go ahead and build our own ones using Hopex Studio, which is the Hopex solution for building custom reports. As in any other Hopex solution, we can build reports on the fly if the information is available on the page using the instant report. And here it's very easy and very straightforward to do so. For example, we can build this report which is showing us what the risk level associated to the selected processing activity. We see that 68% of them have never been actually assessed. There is no risk level associated. 60% have a medium risk level, and 60% have a low risk level. And these reports are actually interactive. So if we click on any portion of them, we get the results, and we can even decide to filter some of the elements in the legend, and eventually then either save the report in order to have it readily available every time we log into Hopex, or add it to the dashboard. The dashboard is fully customizable by any user, and it provides quick access to reports that may be of interest for him. By default, 3 widgets are available in the dashboard, which give us a representation of the processing activity distribution by risk scale with respect to the result of the latest assessment, compliance level, and a distribution by assessment status. So we understand if how many processing activities have never been assessed lately. Last but not least, which is important to mention due to the fact that Hopex is a common platform on which several modules can be activated, such as privacy management, IT portfolio management, governance, risk and compliance, and further. There might be situations in which existing clients who use other Hopex solutions decide to start using Hopex privacy management, and therefore they will want to exploit information which is readily available due to the other modules they have been using. So there are several types of integrations available. First of all, for DPIA clients, so clients who have been documenting their processes using DPIA, it is possible to build the record of processing activity starting from the hierarchy of processes. So here is straightforward to drag an existing process that we want to convert into a processing activity into a department of the organization, and by doing so we are creating a new processing activity which will be linked to the process and which will give us access to all the information of the given process. So for example, here, if we click on OK, and we go check the processing activity that we have just created. So it was on the department legal. So it's this one. And as we can see, we can understand right away that this process was originated from, this processing activity was originated from a process thanks to these two icons. So this icon gives us the possibility to access to the details of the process in read-only mode. So we can understand, we can take a look at everything that was documented by the process owners in the BPA module. This other icon here gives us access to the diagram, which eventually was drawn for the given process. Same type of approach applies to applications, where we are able to take some applications from the register of applications of a given ITPM client, for instance, and drag and drop them either in a department to create a brand new processing activity, or for example, if we want to say that the airport operational process, we know that it's using this application here, we just go ahead and drop it inside the airport operational process, and this will create an element, a child element of air operational process, which is actually referencing the application we have just dropped into it. Okay. This more or less provides an overview of the functionalities of Hopex privacy management. If you need to have further information about the functional perimeter, do not hesitate to reach out to your account representative or to go on the website www.mega.com.
Thanks, Michele, for this very comprehensive demo. We're running a bit out of time, sorry about that, but I hope everybody enjoyed this demo and saw the benefits Hopex brings for data privacy management. I'll just take 2 more minutes to share a success story with you from one of our customers. In order to address the requirements of GDPR, this $700 million US-based global software company decided to adopt our solution to document its processing activities, as you saw with Michele demo, identify regulatory gaps, and implement remediation actions. So using Hopex, this company was able to measure a significant improvement in the way they were documenting their processing activities and reducing by 80% the time spent to identify the risks and carry out security assessment. So this clearly brought benefit to them and measurable benefits to them. If we move to the next slide, we will see basically how Hopex helped them achieving 5 major goals by first mapping processing activities starting from the list of IT assets. So as you could see in Michele's demo, Hopex brings this capability to leverage on the assets available from the enterprise architecture and map them to transfer them to processing activities if needed. The second objective, major goal, was to start from a shared privacy vocabulary. The business critical KPIs were identified in order to drive the risk assessment initiative. And this helped a lot to focus on the processing activities and IT system impacting the most sensitive information. Third major goal achieved was to use Hopex multi-users features to make sure people were getting the proper view on the information they need and facilitating involving appropriate stakeholders for the various tasks. Fourth one is Hopex privacy management that became the single source of truth for the company compliance, allowing people, users to download up-to-date reports and regulatory collaterals and facilitating, ensuring that all the information is shared and available properly. And fifth, but not last but not least, sorry, thanks to the seamless integration with a broader enterprise architecture platform, the company was able to implement the privacy by design principle, ensuring that all new systems and processes were duly evaluated from the privacy team in order to identify regulatory gaps and reduce risk of non-compliance. So this is then an automated journey that is fully processed naturally within the repository. As a conclusion for this success story, the company was able to centrally monitor, able to centrally monitor everything that is going on and making sure that required reports were always up to date. This is a lot of time saved for them, providing the relevant information for the business, and hence Hopex providing greater insight and contextualizing on the list of identified processes, allowing the company to reduce by 80%, again, a key indicator on the benefits, efficiently prioritizing remediation across actions and reducing compliance risks. Sorry to go very fast, but again, running out of time. So we hope we made it clear on how Hopex data privacy management solution can help organizations consolidate and put in place proper steps to provide compliance, regulatory compliance, security, and make things better for the organization. Thanks a lot for your attention. Hope again it was very fruitful for you to see this demo and this presentation. If you have any question, I guess we will reply later on by email as we run out of time. Sorry about that. So if you want to have the closing notes. As you can see on the screen, you can go to our website to get more details, more resources. Feel free to reach back to us if you have any question or if you want to go deeper into this process. Thank you very much.